The moment you start explaining your boundaries to someone who keeps crossing them, something changes, quietly, almost invisibly. On the surface, it looks mature, it looks calm, it looks reasonable. You're choosing words carefully. You're trying not to escalate. You're trying to be fair. You're trying to communicate like an adult. But underneath that maturity, a different message is being sent. Because when a person repeatedly crosses your line and your response is to keep explaining the line, you're not just communicating boundaries, you're demonstrating tolerance. You're showing them how much pressure it takes before you actually enforce anything. And the wrong people don't misunderstand boundaries. They study them the way someone tests a lock. Not once, but over and over. They watch what happens when they push. They listen for what you'll do. They observe how long you'll stay polite. They count how many times you'll repeat yourself before you do something different. They don't need a perfect explanation. They're collecting data. They're calculating the cost of ignoring you. And if that cost is low, if the consequence is only another conversation, another calm speech, another "please respect this," they learn something important. They can cross the line again. This is why over-explaining your boundaries becomes dangerous. Not because boundaries are wrong, not because communication is bad, but because with the wrong person, communication without enforcement teaches them that your limits are flexible. And once it becomes a discussion, the other person has leverage, because now your dignity is up for negotiation. Think about how many times you've walked away from a moment like that with your mind spinning. You replay the conversation in your head like a trial. I should have said it better. I should have been clearer. I should have stayed calmer. I shouldn't have sounded so emotional. And you keep trying to refine the speech, as if the outcome depends on your wording. The outcome usually doesn't change. Not because you didn't communicate well enough, not because your boundary wasn't valid, not because you weren't mature enough, but because the problem was never your explanation. It was your expectation. You expected that if you presented your boundary in the right tone, with the right words, with the right level of calm, a disrespectful person would suddenly become respectful. You expected that if you proved your point clearly enough, they would finally understand. They just didn't care. Or more accurately, they cared more about what they could get than what you asked for. Stoicism teaches that your job is not to convince people to respect you. Your job is to govern yourself. You are responsible for your character, not for managing how someone else responds to it. You control your response, not their respect. And the moment you accept that, you stop pouring energy into the wrong place. You stop trying to manufacture decency in someone who keeps demonstrating that decency isn't their priority. You stop negotiating your dignity, because negotiating your dignity is what keeps you trapped. It keeps you in that exhausting loop. They cross the line, you explain the line. They cross it again, you explain it better. They cross it again. A boundary isn't truly a boundary if it can be argued with forever. A boundary isn't just a sentence. And when someone learns that the only action behind your boundary is more talking, they start treating your boundary like a suggestion. This is where your power begins to leak. Because every time you over-explain, you reveal a hidden hunger. The desire to be understood, the desire to be seen as fair, the desire to be approved of even by the person disrespecting you. You want them to see that you're reasonable. You want them to admit they were wrong. You want them to validate your boundary as legitimate. And that need, however human it is, becomes a handle. Because needing approval from someone who disrespects you is the easiest way for them to control you. If they sense that you need them to see you as good, calm, worthy, or correct, they can keep you on a leash forever. All they have to do is keep pushing your line, then act confused, then make you explain, then watch you spend emotional energy proving you deserve basic respect. And as long as you're stuck trying to prove you deserve it, you're not enforcing it. That's why boundaries collapse. Quietly. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small compromises where you talk more than you act. Stoicism doesn't ask you to become aggressive. It doesn't ask you to become cruel. It doesn't ask you to dominate anyone. Clear about what you will tolerate. Clear about what you will not. Clear about what is yours to control. And that clarity produces something most people rarely experience: inner authority. Inner authority isn't loud, it isn't emotional, it doesn't perform, it doesn't need to convince. And when you begin to move with that kind of inner authority, you stop treating disrespect like a misunderstanding that can be fixed with the right words. You start treating it like what it often is: information. Information about how someone sees you. Information about their character. You don't have to hate them. You don't have to fight them. But you do have to learn from what they're showing you. Because this is the part that changes everything, and the cost doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes the cost is reduced access, less conversation, less vulnerability, less energy, less availability, less warmth. Sometimes the cost is you ending the interaction the moment the line is crossed. No lecture, no long speech, just action. Sometimes the cost is you refusing to keep your dignity on the table as something that can be debated. That's not bitterness, that's discipline. And if you're here listening to this, it's probably because a part of you is exhausted, not just tired of disrespect, but tired of performing strength instead of living it. Tired of rehearsing speeches you've already given. Tired of explaining obvious things to people who understand perfectly well. Tired of walking away from moments feeling like you failed, when the truth is, you were never meant to win that game through words. Because there are people who don't respond to calm explanations with respect. They respond to consequences with adjustment. And Stoicism gives you the mental structure to stop feeling guilty about that. It teaches you that you can be kind without being available to disrespect. You can be calm without being permissive. You can be clear without being cruel. You can hold boundaries without carrying bitterness. And this is where your power returns, not in one big confrontation, but in a subtle internal shift. You stop treating your dignity as something you must explain, and you start treating it as something you simply live. Not because the world suddenly becomes fair. If you value clarity without cruelty, boundaries without bitterness, and discipline without drama, then you're in the right place. And subscribing, if you choose to, shouldn't be a favor to a channel. It should be a commitment to a version of you that refuses to live as a reaction ever again. Because the first step isn't learning better words. The first step is realizing you don't owe repeated explanations to repeated disrespect. You owe yourself a standard, and you owe yourself the courage to back it with action. Disrespect is rarely random. The boundary push was just bad timing. Because if it's random, then it's easier to tolerate. If it's random, then you don't have to make a decision. You can tell yourself, they didn't mean it, and keep moving. But here's the uncomfortable reality this section is about. A lot of disrespect isn't emotional. It's a test. When someone interrupts you again and again, when they make subtle jokes about you in front of others, when they brush off your opinions, when they keep nudging your boundaries in small, deliberate ways, they're not always being careless. Often, they're observing, they're collecting data, they're silently asking a question without ever saying it out loud. And the way you respond becomes their answer. That's why the same pattern repeats. Not because you're unlucky, not because you keep meeting bad people, but because many people, consciously or unconsciously, interact with the world through pressure. They push to see what moves. They probe to see what holds. They test to see who bends. If you explain, they learn you'll negotiate. If you snap, they learn you're emotionally invested. If you freeze, they learn you avoid conflict. None of these reactions make you weak. They make you human. But they do teach people something. And that's what most people miss. Your reaction is not just a moment, it's a lesson. Disrespect often begins small on purpose. Think about how disrespect usually shows up. It's rarely an obvious insult right away. It's rarely someone looking you in the eye and saying, "I don't respect you." Instead, it's a small thing. A little interruption that they don't apologize for. A dismissive tone. A forgetting of something important to you. A boundary crossed with a smile. It's designed to be deniable. That's part of the strategy. They want to push you, but they also want to pretend they didn't. They want to see whether you'll hold the line without forcing them into accountability. Because if you call it out, they can say, "Wow, you're sensitive." So the disrespect stays small, at first, because small disrespect is easier to get away with. It's the testing phase, the probe, the first tap on the wall to find the hollow spot. And if there's no resistance, the push becomes stronger next time. That's how it works. A boundary that isn't reinforced becomes a suggestion, and a suggestion gets ignored. People assume disrespect comes from stress. Often it comes from advantage. Not always in a cartoon villain way, not always with conscious intent, but strategic in the sense that they're testing outcomes. They're seeing what gets them status, attention, control, or comfort. Disrespect, is one of the fastest ways to check your position in a dynamic. If they interrupt you and you let it slide, they feel higher. If they make a joke at your expense and you laugh along, they learn they can use you for entertainment. And once they've learned that, they repeat it. Not because they hate you, but because it works. Because explanation assumes confusion. But many disrespectful behaviors are not confusion. They're feedback. They're a person learning what the environment allows. Now let's bring it to a real moment. Think about the last time someone crossed a line with you. Maybe they spoke over you in a meeting like your voice didn't matter. Maybe they laughed at something personal you shared. Maybe they used sarcasm to make you feel small in front of other people. Maybe they pushed past a boundary you already stated and acted like it was no big deal. What did you do? Did you feel your heart kick up and fire back with anger? None of those responses makes you bad, but all of them send signals. Anger tells them, I'm emotionally invested in this, I can be pulled. Silence tells them, I avoid conflict, I will likely tolerate this. And wanting approval is the easiest handle to grab. Because once someone knows you want to be seen as good, fair, calm, or likable, they can manipulate that need. They can keep pushing and then act like you're the problem for noticing. They can keep crossing lines and count on you to soften it because you don't want to look difficult. This is why the pain of disrespect isn't just the insult itself. It's the story you tell yourself afterward. The story that says, what they did means I'm not valued. Or, if I say something, I'll look weak. Or, if I don't fix this perfectly, I'll lose something. This is the line people don't like to admit. Need is leverage. The moment someone senses that you need them to see you as worthy, the balance shifts. Now you're not just protecting a boundary, you're protecting an image. And protecting an image makes you predictable. Because you'll bend to keep looking calm. You'll explain to keep looking fair. You'll swallow words to keep looking composed. And while you're busy managing perception, they're busy collecting control. You may believe that if you explain your side clearly enough, they'll finally respect you. But if respect depended on explanation, it would have appeared by now. Respect isn't born from your ability to articulate your boundary. Respect is born from your willingness to enforce it. And that enforcement doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be dramatic. But it has to be real. Because when you over-explain, you aren't strengthening your boundary. You're unintentionally saying, this is open for discussion. And that is exactly why the disrespect continues. It isn't confusion. It's feedback. Predictability gives the other person control. Here's what happens next. The more you react in predictable ways, the more predictable you become. And predictability is how people gain control over you. If they know you'll get angry, they push until you explode and then call you unstable. If they know you'll freeze, they keep pushing and take what they want. If they know you'll over-explain, they trigger you and watch you spend energy trying to win fairness. They press a button. You produce a reaction. They get the payoff they want. Attention, superiority, entertainment, control, emotional fuel. And as long as the payoff is there, the behavior continues. This is why Stoicism teaches you to interrupt the script, not by fighting harder, but by changing your internal posture. They want to pass the test. They want to prove they're calm. They want to craft the perfect response. They want to be seen as reasonable. They want the other person to finally acknowledge the truth. That posture keeps you inside the storm. Stoicism offers a different posture. Become the examiner. What are they trying to gain from this? The moment you ask that question, your emotional temperature drops, because now you're not trapped in the insult. You're studying the mechanism. You're no longer fighting for approval. You're observing a pattern. And when you see it as a pattern, disrespect loses some of its edge. It becomes information rather than injury. Not because it's okay, but because it no longer owns your nervous system. This is where the simplest tool becomes the most powerful: the pause. When you pause, even for a few seconds, you stop giving instant data. You stop feeding the script. You stop letting their timing become your timing. There is strength in that pause, not theatrical strength, quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. When someone makes a cutting remark and you don't rush to defend yourself, something subtle happens. You're evaluating. You're deciding whether that comment deserves entry into your mind at all, because most people let disrespect walk straight into their head and rearrange the furniture. They react immediately, and the other person learns, I can move you. But when you pause, you send a different message. You don't control the tempo here. None of this means becoming cold or cruel. It doesn't mean treating everyone like an enemy. It means becoming deliberate. You choose when to engage and when to disengage. You answer with facts, not desperation. If someone says you never help, you state what you've done without emotion. If someone says you're too sensitive, you acknowledge their opinion without adopting it. You hold your ground quietly. Over time, that consistency changes how you are perceived. The test loses its reward. The pressure stops working the way it used to. Disrespect only continues where it finds access. When you stop reacting automatically. When you stop explaining your worth. The dynamic shifts. It won't always shift smoothly. People who benefit from the old pattern may push harder at first. They'll test again to see if the old version of you returns. You are no longer participating in the script they wrote. You're writing your own. Because up until that point, you're usually responding like a student being graded. You walk into interactions hoping things will be fair, hoping people will play by the same rules you play by, hoping that if you're polite enough, calm enough, clear enough, the other person will get it. And when they don't, you take it personally. You try harder. You explain more. You rehearse what you should have said. You carry the conversation home with you like a heavy bag you can't put down. You replay every detail, looking for the moment where you could have been better, clearer, stronger, more composed. That's the student mindset. If I perform well enough, I'll earn respect. Then the test becomes unwinnable because you're trying to pass an exam designed by someone who benefits when you fail. Not in a smug way, not in a superior way, in a clear way, a grounded way. You stop asking the question that keeps you trapped inside the storm, and you replace it with a question that pulls you outside the storm. What are they trying to get from this? If someone interrupts you, what are they trying to gain? If someone makes a joke at your expense, what are they trying to gain? If someone dismisses your opinion, what are they trying to gain? If someone pushes your boundary again, what are they trying to gain? Attention, superiority, a reaction, control, emotional leverage? That single shift from injury to information changes your emotional temperature. It doesn't make the disrespect okay, but it stops the disrespect from owning you. Now you're not just feeling it, you're reading it. You're not just reacting, you're studying. The first freedom is seeing the pattern. People who disrespect others often repeat the same moves. That's why learning to observe matters so much. Because when you're caught in emotion, everything feels unique, personal, chaotic. But when you step back, you start noticing patterns. The same tone, the same little digs disguised as humor, the same accidental boundary crossings, the same way they become charming when they want something and dismissive when you need something, the same way they escalate when you don't respond the way they expect. Patterns are powerful because patterns are predictable, and what is predictable is manageable. This is where Stoic calm starts to form. Not because you suddenly feel nothing, but because you're no longer drowning in surprise. The pause interrupts the entire dynamic. Once you start observing, the most important tool becomes simple: the pause. Most disrespect relies on speed. It relies on you reacting instantly, because the instant reaction gives them data. It shows them what works. It shows them where you're sensitive. It shows them what button to press next time. But when you pause, even for 2 seconds, you interrupt the system. You stop giving them immediate information. You stop feeding the reward loop. And something subtle happens in that pause. You move from being inside the moment to being above it. You're evaluating. That pause is quiet strength. Disrespect becomes information, not identity. A big part of why disrespect hurts is because we treat it like a verdict. We hear an insult and our mind translates it into identity. You're too sensitive becomes there's something wrong with me. You never do enough becomes I'm failing. You're not important becomes I'm small. That joke in front of others becomes I'm not respected. And now the disrespect isn't just a moment, it becomes a story about who you are. Stoicism teaches you to question that story, not by denying emotion, but by separating fact from interpretation. The fact might be they said something cutting. The interpretation is that defines me. And that interpretation is where the pain multiplies. When you shift into examiner mode, you stop accepting their words as truth and start seeing them as data about the person using them. If someone tries to get a rise out of you, it reveals their need for control. If someone uses jokes to diminish you, it reveals insecurity or cruelty, or both. If someone crosses boundaries repeatedly, it reveals entitlement. If someone dismisses you consistently, it reveals their desire to feel superior. This doesn't mean you become cynical. It means you become accurate. You stop letting other people's behavior become a mirror that defines you. Jung's insight, why certain disrespect stings more than others. Now, even with clarity, there's a truth you can't ignore. Some disrespect hits deeper. Some comments roll off your back like nothing. And then one sentence lands and stays with you for days. You replay it. It echoes. It follows you into quiet moments. Carl Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That's not a comforting quote. It's a mirror. It suggests that when someone's disrespect hits hard, it often touches a wound that already exists inside you. Not because they're right, but because they hit something unresolved. This is important because manipulators, again, consciously or not, are often good at finding hollow spots. They test different phrases like tapping on walls. They watch for the flinch. The reaction tells them where the wound is. If you shrink, they note it. If you get emotional, they note it. And now they know what to use next time. So the goal isn't to become a person who feels nothing. The goal is to become a person who knows their sensitive spots. Because when you know where you're vulnerable, you become harder to manipulate. You don't react from surprise. You respond from awareness. You can say internally, that one hit an insecurity I already carry, and just recognizing that reduces its grip. The real shift isn't better comebacks, it's a different posture. Most people think confidence is having the perfect response ready, the sharp line, the calm speech, the flawless delivery. But this script is pointing to something deeper. The real shift is not about crafting better comebacks, it's about changing your internal posture. You stop entering conversations hoping to be validated. You stop assuming fairness will protect you, and when you see it that way, disrespect becomes a kind of offer. If you give them anger, the transaction completes. If you give them desperation, the transaction completes. If you give them a long explanation, the transaction completes. They get what they came for. Emotional control. But when you respond with calm observation, or simple facts, or silence that doesn't flinch, the transaction fails. The energy they expected doesn't arrive. This is why someone can throw a hook and you don't have to bite. You can see the hook. You can name it internally. Calm evaluation is not weakness, it's authority. There's a common fear people have when they stop reacting. If I don't respond, I'm letting them win. But winning is a childish frame when you're dealing with disrespect. The question isn't, how do I win this moment? Sometimes the most powerful response is simple and grounded. If someone makes a cutting remark, you pause, look at them, and say nothing for a beat. If someone labels you, you refuse the label and return to reality. If someone pushes for drama, you don't provide it. That is not passivity, that is control, practicing examiner mode in real time. Here's what this looks like in real life, moment by moment. Notice the first impulse, the heat, the urge to defend, the urge to explain, the urge to prove. Pause. Ask the examiner question. What are they trying to extract from me right now? Choose the response that starves the pattern. Calm fact, short boundary, silence with eye contact, exit without drama. Over time, this becomes natural. You stop rehearsing arguments. You stop living in, I should have said, because you're no longer playing their game. And here's the quiet payoff. You keep your self-respect. Even if they stay the same, you don't erode yourself trying to fix them. The deeper theme, you step outside the script. You stop being predictable. You stop being easy to provoke. And that doesn't just change the moment, it changes the entire dynamic over time. Because tests only continue where they get rewarded. When the reward disappears, the pattern weakens. It may not disappear immediately. The person might push harder. They might try again. They might try a different angle. But you've already shifted. You're no longer fighting to be understood. You're deciding how much access they get. And that decision, quiet, internal, firm, is the foundation of everything that follows. The moment you stop reacting the way you used to, something strange happens. At first, you expect it to get easier. You expect the disrespect to fade because you're finally handling it right. You expect that calmness will calm the room. You expect that restraint will earn respect. Sometimes it does. But often, especially with the wrong person, it does the opposite. They escalate. Not because you failed, not because your detachment didn't work, but because you just interrupted their reward system. And when a reward system breaks, behavior doesn't disappear politely. It spikes, it pushes, it tests harder. Stoicism calls this stage discipline. Psychology calls it something more clinical, an extinction burst. But the idea is simple. When a person is used to getting a certain reaction from you, guilt, anger, explanations, emotional energy, and you suddenly stop giving it, they don't immediately adjust. They press harder, like a vending machine that didn't drop the snack. They shake it, they hit the buttons again, and if you don't understand what's happening, you'll think, I made it worse. But you didn't make it worse, you made it ineffective. Before we get into the escalation, we need to define what you're building here, because most people confuse detachment with being cold. Coldness is emotional shutdown. It's numbness. It's a wall built from fear. Cruelty is revenge. It's the desire to punish. Detachment is something else entirely. It's clarity. Detachment is the ability to step half a step back inside your own mind and watch what's happening without being swallowed by it. It's staying present without letting the situation hijack you. It's not indifference. It's control. Picture a scientist standing over a beaker in a lab. The chemicals bubble, the reaction intensifies, the colors shift, smoke rises. But the scientist doesn't panic. They don't take it personally. They observe, they record, they adjust, they keep their hands steady. That posture, calm observation in the middle of intensity, is what you're training. Because disrespect wants you to personalize everything. It wants you to feel attacked. It wants you to get hooked. It wants you to react quickly. Detachment says, I see what's happening. I'm not jumping in. Replace the wounded question with the strategic one. How could they do this to me? Why are they treating me like this? Those questions put you in the center of the storm. They keep you emotionally fused with the event. Stoicism teaches a different move. Replace those questions with something mechanical. What are they trying to extract from me right now? Attention? Validation? Control? A reaction? Drama? That shift might sound small, but it changes your nervous system. You stop seeing the person as an enemy and start seeing them as a pattern. And patterns can be studied. Patterns are predictable, and what's predictable is less scary. This is where calm begins, not because they stopped, but because you stopped being surprised. The escalation, when the old reaction disappears. Now let's talk about what happens next. When your usual reaction disappears, the other person often intensifies their behavior. This is the part that unsettles people because it feels like proof that detachment isn't working. But it's usually the opposite. Think of an elevator button that doesn't light up. You don't press it once and calmly accept it. Most people press it again, then again more firmly, then again with frustration. Only when you're convinced it's not working do you stop and take the stairs. Human behavior works the same way. If someone is used to pressing the guilt button and getting you to apologize, they'll press it harder when you don't respond. If they're used to your long explanations, they'll increase pressure to make you start defending yourself again. This is the extinction burst, the pattern trying to survive without the reward it depends on. And here's what most people do in that moment. They panic. They interpret escalation as failure. They think, I should go back to how I was. I made this worse. I should smooth it over. I should apologize. I should explain. But returning to old reactions resets the entire dynamic. It teaches the other person one lesson. All I have to do is push harder. That's why this stage requires discipline. Not because you're trying to win, but because you're refusing to teach the wrong lesson. Anyone can stay calm when people are reasonable. The real test is staying steady when someone raises the volume. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." That's not a call to revenge, it's a reminder not to mirror chaos. The goal isn't to punish them, the goal is to protect your character. In escalation moments, your nervous system wants relief. It wants the conflict to stop. It wants peace now. And the easiest way to get short-term peace is to give the other person the reaction they're demanding. Apologize, explain, get emotional, fight back. But that relief is expensive because it keeps the cycle alive. Seneca warned, "He who angers you conquers you." In the middle of escalation, that line becomes practical. If they can provoke you into losing control, the old pattern wins. But if you remain steady, something begins to collapse inside the dynamic. Not instantly, not dramatically, but slowly, because the reward disappears. Don't resist with emotion, starve with clarity. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists." When you resist disrespect with emotional force, anger, defensiveness, sarcasm, you feed it, you give it fuel, you turn it into a battle, which is exactly what many disrespectful people want. Detachment starves the behavior instead of fighting it. This doesn't mean tolerating abuse. It doesn't mean staying in harm. It means that in the moment, you don't hand them the emotional energy they're hunting. The simplest responses are often the strongest. During this stage, your responses become smaller, not bigger. Disrespect thrives on emotional language. It throws labels like hooks, selfish, dramatic, lazy, useless, irresponsible. Those aren't descriptions, they're bait. They're meant to trigger identity defense. If you argue with labels, you enter their frame. Now you're debating who you are. And identity arguments have no finish line. They can go forever because they aren't about truth, they're about control. So the shift is this. Stop debating adjectives and return to facts. Trying to restore fairness. A steadier response is factual and short. I did the dishes, they're in the rack. No heat, no lecture, no performance, just reality. And you move on. Notice what you did there. You didn't accept the label and you didn't attack theirs. You stepped out of the exchange. Without friction, the fire loses oxygen. This feels almost too simple, which is why most people don't believe it works. But simplicity often signals stability. Long defenses often signal insecurity. Dramatic rebuttals often signal that you've been hooked. Short, steady responses signal, now here's the honest part. Even with facts and calmness, you may still feel that sting afterward. Certain comments land close to insecurities you already carry. That doesn't mean the other person is right. It means they touched something tender. This is where detachment also protects you internally. When you react impulsively, you usually replay the moment later with regret. You think of what you should have said. You feel embarrassed. You feel like you lost control. And that inner replay becomes another form of suffering. Detachment reduces that noise. You may still feel discomfort, but you retain self-respect. You can look back and say, I stayed aligned. I didn't betray myself. And that alignment matters more than winning a moment. Once you recognize the extinction burst as predictable, it stops feeling like a personal crisis. It becomes mechanical. They pushed the button. It didn't work. That's it. And when you see it that way, your steadiness becomes easier to maintain. You're thinking, and your only job is not to pay it. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." In this context, freedom isn't controlling them. Freedom is mastering your impulses under pressure. When they push drama, you return to facts. When they throw accusations, you examine them calmly before deciding if they deserve a reply. And at first it will feel unnatural because you're breaking your own habits too. Your mind wants the old script because it's familiar. Detachment interrupts that reflex. But every time you remain steady, you're not just retraining them, you're retraining you. You're building a new pattern in your own character, calm under pressure. The turning point, the reward system collapses. The intensity loses momentum because it's not being fed. Pressing the button becomes exhausting. Eventually, the person either changes tactics or moves on to an easier source of reaction. They may never admit it, they may never apologize, they may never understand. And here's the best part. Even if the other person remains difficult, you stop being dragged into unnecessary battles. You keep your energy, you keep your dignity, you keep your inner space intact. That's the real victory. Not that they became respectful overnight, sometimes they won't, but that you became steady. You didn't make the situation worse. You made it unsustainable. And from that steady ground, you're ready for the next layer, deciding access, deciding distance, deciding what kind of relationships deserve your energy at all. After you've learned to pause, after you've learned to observe patterns, after you've practiced detachment through escalation, there's a deeper shift waiting underneath all of it. And it's not about what you say in the moment, it's not about comebacks, it's not even about handling disrespect. It's about worth. Because even if you master calm facts, even if you stop feeding the drama, even if you can sit in silence without flinching, some words will still land, some labels will still sting, some insults will echo in your mind long after the conversation ends. And if you're honest, you know why. It's because somewhere inside, a part of you is afraid they might be right. That is the piece most people don't like to admit, but it's the hinge the whole dynamic turns on. If a stranger walked past you and called you something ridiculous, you'd probably keep walking. It wouldn't stick. It wouldn't follow you home. It wouldn't replay at 2 a.m. because it wouldn't connect to anything real inside you. But when someone says, "You're selfish," and it burns, or "You're too sensitive," and it stays, or "You're not doing enough," and it shakes you, what's happening isn't that their words are powerful. And once you see that, the work becomes clear. The goal isn't to become sharper. The goal is to become more grounded. The real armor is self-acceptance. Toxic people, whether they mean to or not, are often skilled at detecting insecurity. They test different words the way someone taps on walls to find a hollow spot. They throw comments into the air and watch your face. They observe your posture. They study your reaction. If you get defensive, they learn something. If you over-explain, they learn something. If you shrink, they learn something. They found the wound. That's why the deepest protection is not a better boundary speech. It's not a more confident tone. It's not even perfect composure. It's ownership. When you fully own your imperfections privately, no one can shame you publicly with them. When you are honest with yourself, insults lose voltage. When you stop pretending, you stop being fragile. Imagine being able to say internally, calmly, "Yes, I'm still growing. Yes, I can be sensitive sometimes. Yes, I made mistakes." And once there's nothing to expose, the insult loses its power. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That's true, because most people spend their lives trying to protect an image, and anything that threatens that image feels like an attack. But when you stop living as an image and start living as a whole person, strengths and flaws included, there's less for anyone to grab. You start responding from clarity. Criticism becomes information, not identity. This is where Stoicism gets practical. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake in any thought or action, I shall gladly change." That line is often quoted, but most people miss what it actually means. It means, my ego doesn't get to run my life. It means, if there's something to improve, I will improve it, quietly. So when someone disrespects you or criticizes you, there are only two possibilities. There's truth in it. There's no truth in it. If there's truth in it, you don't have to argue. You can correct it, you can adjust, you can grow, and you do that for yourself, not to satisfy them. Either way, you remain steady. That's real power. The ability to receive information without collapsing and to reject nonsense without needing to fight. The hardest internal decision: kill the hope. Now we come to the shift that changes the entire game, and it happens quietly in your mind. This is the part people resist because hope feels noble. Hope feels loving. Hope feels patient. Hope lets you stay connected to the version of them you wish existed. But in the wrong place, hope becomes a chain. As long as you believe they'll wake up one day, apologize sincerely, and transform into the person you need them to be, you remain emotionally invested in their potential. You keep explaining yourself because you hope they will finally understand. You keep arguing because you hope they will finally admit they were wrong. You keep waiting because you hope the good version will return. That hope keeps you tied to a future that may never arrive. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." A lot of that suffering comes from imagined change. You imagine the apology. You imagine the breakthrough. You imagine the day they finally get it. Reality stays the same. Your expectation creates the pain. It's clarity. It's looking at someone and saying internally, without hate, this is who they are right now. And that acceptance is what breaks the cycle of disappointment. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that sounds harsh, but is actually a form of mental preparation. When you wake up, tell yourself the people you deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. He wrote it to stop being shocked by human nature. When you expect the storm to be a storm, you bring an umbrella. You don't stand in the rain demanding sunshine. You adjust your behavior instead, and that adjustment is where your peace begins. The practical outcome: access changes. Once you kill the illusion, something practical becomes unavoidable. You realize your time, your warmth, your attention, your vulnerability are not unlimited resources. They're valuable, and you stop handing valuable things to people who repeatedly misuse them. For a long time, you may have given freely, believing generosity would create fairness. But when generosity meets disrespect, it turns into depletion. So you adjust quietly. You're polite but not emotionally available. You stop volunteering personal details that can be twisted. You stop offering parts of yourself to someone who treats them carelessly. This isn't coldness, and here's the interesting part. When people realize they can no longer trigger you, many of them stop trying. The jokes lose payoff. The accusations lose momentum. The drama stops being entertaining. Some move on to easier targets, people who still react predictably. Others begin to show restraint. Not necessarily warmth, not necessarily kindness, but restraint. They sense that the boundary is no longer flexible. You didn't demand that. A lot of people struggle here because they feel guilty. They worry they're being mean. They worry they're changing. But there's a difference between punishment and protection. Protection is meant to preserve you. Both can look similar on the outside because access decreases. But the intention changes the entire energy. When you're protecting rather than punishing, you're not bitter. You're not performing distance. You're simply aligning your behavior with reality. Stoicism isn't about making others pay. It's about keeping your inner life clean. Epictetus taught, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And your reaction includes your willingness to keep offering access after the pattern is clear. Freedom begins when you stop giving your power away through hope, approval-seeking, and automatic reactions. Seneca said, "He who angers you conquers you." The same is true of shame. The person who can shame you controls you, if you accept the shame. But if you examine it and find it empty, the hook doesn't catch. That's why the deepest change is internal. It's not about controlling their behavior, it's about stabilizing your sense of self so completely that their behavior loses its grip. The quiet ending: your life gets quieter. Here's what happens when you truly stop negotiating your dignity. Not because the world suddenly becomes kinder. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop fantasizing about them finally understanding. You stop carrying the emotional aftermath for days. You respond simply. You adjust access. You move on. And that quiet isn't emptiness, it's stability. It's the feeling of living from internal approval instead of external validation. It's the relief of not needing to be understood by someone who has shown you they won't understand. It's the freedom of no longer bargaining for fairness. Do this once, fully, internally, and the shift will be felt. Not because you demanded respect, because you stopped living as if your dignity was negotiable. The day you stop explaining your worth is the day your life becomes steadier. Not louder, not harsher, just unshakable.